Often, it takes a while for a wrestler to reach their peak. Sometimes it can take upwards of a decade, in fact, but on occasion, someone will step into the ring and hit that peak early, with this surprising everyone around them. But just who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the Ultimate Warrior. Yes, while few fans are ever going to call the Ultimate Warrior a great in-ring performer, he certainly had a great charisma to his character. And this unique charisma allowed him to find success very quickly after entering the industry back in the mid-80s. So quickly would he find success, in fact, by the time 1987 came around, he'd already be wrestling for WWF. And with his look pretty much being made for that company, it would only be a year before Vince McMahon was giving him the Intercontinental title. But even that wouldn't be the end of Warrior's rise. No, as the months went on, he'd continue to grow in popularity to the point that pretty soon he was starting to approach Hulk Hogan levels. And this made the boss start to wonder if he shouldn't be pushing this rookie in the position of top dog instead. So it was that at WrestleMania 6 then, the Ultimate Warrior defeated the Hulkster to become WWF champion, with this starting what was supposed to be a lengthy run as the ace of the company for the Indiana native. As we all know now, though, that would mark the peak of the Warrior, as once it became clear his run as champion wasn't doing Hogan levels of drawing money, he'd drop the title less than a year later. And this would begin his downfall, as backstage problems eventually led to him being released on more than one occasion. Would he ever get a second wind? Not really. No, for the rest of his career, Warrior would never be able to reach that same height he briefly had during the late 80s, and this makes him a prime example of someone who peaked early. But he's not the only person who this statement applies to. Hell, there are plenty of others throughout WWE history who have found themselves in the exact same situation. And one of them would be our next subject as it happens, Jack Swagger. Now we know Jack Swagger has had a decent career in wrestling for a while. In fact, as recently as a couple of years ago, he was working for AEW under the name of Jake Hager. But to say he was on top of the card there would be a lie. No, his time at the top of the card happened right at the beginning of his run. It was back in 2008 when, upon joining the main roster of WWE, Swagger caught the attention of Vince McMahon, who saw in him a superstar. And that was exactly why the boss made a quick push to have the Fargo native go all the way to the top here. How would he do this? Well, by having him win the Money in the Bank ladder match at WrestleMania 26, less than 2 years after his debut. Obviously then, this meant Jack now had a world title shot to cash in at any time of his choosing, and this was something he wouldn't waste too much time in making use of. No, it would only be 1 month later then that the big man called his shot at then World Heavyweight Champion Chris Jericho and beat him in short order. And this meant that, while still in his second year on the WWE main roster, Jack Swagger was already holding a world title, quite an achievement considering how long others around him had waited for such an honor. Of course, like with the Ultimate Warrior before him though, this reign ended up being a bit of a wash. So much so that he ended up dropping it to Rey Mysterio only 79 days later. As you can imagine then, this did not bode well for Jack's future, and any concerns people might have had about this were confirmed when, as the months and years progressed, he'd find himself falling down into a mid-card role, never again getting even so much as a sniff of the world title scene. Even when he went to the aforementioned All Elite Wrestling, Swagger would always be positioned in more of a prelim guy role, meaning he was never able to recapture that early success no matter where he went. But at least there were other Ruthless Aggression stars who this happened to as well, one of whom is our next subject, Carito. That's right, back when Carito made his WWE main roster debut in 2004, it didn't take long for him to hit his stride. And we meant that when we say it because it would be on his first match as part of the SmackDown roster that he'd beat John Cena to become the new United States champion. Where would he go from here? Well, on a bit of an undefeated streak, as for the next few months, nobody could beat the San Juan native. Really, it looked like this was going to be the start of big things for Carlito, and that his future in WWE was going to be very bright indeed, something which was only further implied after he moved to Raw in 2005 and became Intercontinental Champion too. Sadly though, this would end up being the high watermark of his run, as soon after he dropped that belt, the rookie would begin sliding down the card. Why was this? Well, one of the more common rumors is that some people in power found Carito to lack the hard work needed to be a top star behind the scenes, and that this scuppered his chances of ever being treated like a true main event guy. Not that he wouldn't do anything following on from his early success, of course. No, he'd remain in WWE for a while as a mid-card act, but the fact is, he was never able to even come close to matching that level of early success again. Even when he left the company for a few years and returned again during the 2020s, he'd still be a lower card guy. Is this a blow for him? We've no doubt it is, but such a fate might have been an even bigger blow to our next subject, Kenny Dykstra. And we say that because when Kenny Dykstra was first moved up to the WWE main roster in 2006, it really looked like big things were going to be in his future. Sure, the gimmick he had back then, 1/5 of the male cheerleader group, the Spirit Squad, wasn't exactly one which was going to turn him into a star on its own or anything, but the belief was that, with him appearing to be the most talented member of that stable, this was just going to be a foot in the door to greater things down the line. Hell, for all of the comedy nature of the Spirit Squad, Kenny would actually become a one-time World Tag Team Champion while he was a part of that group, with this marking his first title win in WWE. Unfortunately, though, it would also be his last, because once the stable disbanded later that year and Dykstra was pushed into the singles division, something about him just stopped clicking. What was the problem here exactly? It's hard to say, but it was clear that the Massachusetts native as a solo act just didn't work the way Vince McMahon had hoped it might. And so because of this, he'd quickly find himself falling down the card as he failed to recapture any of that early success. Seriously. So bad would things get that by the time 2008 came, he'd be gone from WWE altogether, with this forcing him to spend much of his career which followed on the indie circuit. And that would put him in the same category as our next subject, another Ruthless Aggression era tag team act who peaked early, one who goes by the name of Renee Dri. Yes, it's long been a trivia note amongst wrestling fans that if we don't count Nicholas, the young child who won the Raw tag team titles with Braun Strowman at WrestleMania 34, then Renee Dri is the youngest WWE champion on record, because as part of La Resistance with Sylvain Grenier, he'd win the World Tag Team titles back in 2003 when he was still just 19. Needless to say then, at this time, this felt like a big stamp of approval for the New Brunswick native from his bosses, and it made everyone assume that the main event scene was going to be in his future. But this was not the way things would work out in the end. No, despite winning gold earlier than anyone else had, Dri was never able to translate this into further success, particularly when he was pushed as a singles act starting in 2004. Why was that? Well, like with Kenny Dykstra, there was something which just never clicked about Renee as a solo performer, and this led to him eventually leaving WWE altogether in 2007. Sure, this might have been disappointing for him given how hard he started out, but at least Renee Dri will always have that early success to his name. And this is something no one will ever be able to take away from him, at least not until someone younger wins a title. Of course, it's not just the men who can reach their peaks early, though. No, sometimes the women of the wrestling world can do this too. And if you want a prime example of that being the case, you only need to look towards our next subject, Kelly Kelly. Yes, let's travel back to 2006 for a moment. That was the year where Kelly Kelly first made her debut on the WWE main roster, or at least main roster-ish. You see, back then the Jacksonville native would be a mainstay of WWECW. That said, despite being on a third-tier show, Barbie Blank would prove to be such a hit with fans at the time, it wouldn't take long for her to move over to Raw and SmackDown instead. And it was there she would find even greater success, despite only just being old enough to legally drink at this point. Sure, a big part of what made her popular amongst fans was her looks and her early gimmick of being an exhibitionist. But this was something she was able to take advantage of to the point that before long, she'd be winning the Divas title. And once she'd done this, Kelly Kelly was a made woman as far as her spot in the women's division was concerned. Or at least she was until she wasn't. And we say that because it would all change for her by the time the early 2010s came around, with this being the point she'd disappear from WWE altogether. Why was this? Well, Kelly would decide to leave WWE here as she'd look elsewhere for success in places like the world of reality TV. But what about another woman who came around a few years later? Someone who represented something very different for women's wrestling? Well, she'd also peak early as it happened, though in her case it would be more to do with injury than anything else. That's right, it's time for us to talk about Paige. That's right, Paige would sign on the dotted line with WWE back in the early 2010s following a successful run on the UK indie scene. But with her still being incredibly young at this point, not even 20 years old yet, there were some concerns about whether or not it was a little bit too much too soon for her. In the end, though, any doubters that the Englishwoman had would be proven wrong when, mere months into her runs in both Florida Championship Wrestling and NXT, she showed herself to be light years ahead of most of the other ladies around her. And this led to her pretty quickly changing the game for what the women could do. So much would she change things, in fact, her series against Emma during the early days of the Black and Gold brand is now widely considered to represent the first sparks of the women's revolution. And with this acclaim came title success not just in NXT, where she became the inaugural women's champion in 2013, but also on the main roster, where she'd win the Divas title from AJ Lee on her first night there in April of 2014. And to make matters even more impressive, when she achieved this latter feat, she was still only 21 years old. That said, while this might have seemed like the start of a lengthy career on top for Paige, a neck injury would cut things short just 4 years later, forcing her into early retirement. And sure, while she would eventually return in AEW in 2022 as Saraya, initially to much fanfare, her run there was not anywhere near as successful as her run in WWE had been. And while this means she peaked early, it also means she was a trailblazer in many ways, one all women wrestling today should be thankful for. But let's move away now from the stars of the PG era and onto stars of a prior time instead, specifically the Attitude Era. After all, it's there we find our next subject, a man who would at one point feel like he had the world at his feet early on in his run, Test. Seriously, while it's gone forgotten now, back during the turn of the millennium period, Test looked like he was going to be a huge breakout star in WWF. Come on now, this was a man who, only a year into his run, was booked to be the on-screen fiancé of Stephanie McMahon. As we all know now, this never worked out, and after this, Test never managed to make it to the main event. Sure, he would still have a role on the show going forward, but it would be a role which saw him fill much more of a mid-card spot during feuds against the likes of Scott Steiner and Edge. Could things have still turned around for Test by the time the Ruthless Aggression era was dawning? Sure, there was still every possibility of him once more reaching those early levels of success he'd found and finally becoming a world title contender in the process. But alas, no matter how hard he tried, things would not work out that way. No, instead of reaching his full potential, the Ontario native would only see himself falling further and further down the card to the point that come 2004, he'd be gone from WWE entirely. Where would he go from there? Well, spells in places like TNA, as well as a brief return to WWE in 2006 would be in the Canadian's future. But even when he got that WWE return, he'd be sequestered away on the dreaded WWECW brand. So it wasn't like he was ever going to reach the same heights as he'd reached in 1999. No, by this point, those days were sadly over for Test. And that's the way things would remain for him up until the point he sadly passed away in 2009 at just 33 years old. And Andrew Martin is unfortunately far from the only wrestler who has died before their time, meaning they never got to reach the same peaks they had during their early days. In fact, another prime example of this can be found in our next subject, the one, the only, the Big Boss Man. Yes, well, it might have seemed like the Big Boss Man had a lengthy career, mostly on account of him being a part of the two biggest boom periods in WWE history. He was actually pretty young when all this happened. In fact, when his initial run during the Golden Era was reaching its peak, a peak which saw him at various points both feud with and cozy up to Hulk Hogan, he was still in his mid-20s. Obviously then, this could have been way too much way too soon for many people in his position, but Ray Traylor was able to manage the situation fine, so much so that after his first run ended, he spent a few years in WCW, all before then returning for the Attitude Era. Even when this happened though, while he might have come across like an old legend in comparison to some members of the roster, he was still only in his mid-30s. To give it some context, he was only 1 year older than Stone Cold Steve Austin. And that meant he still had a lot of gas in the tank as the turn of the millennium dawned, enough to where he'd be able to completely reinvent his character into that of a more sadistic heel. What happened to the Boss Man after this? Well, that was when things started to move in a downwards trajectory. That's right, after reaching such heights so early on in his career, the second half of the Georgia native's run simply couldn't match up. And that's because this period would see him mill away in the undercard of the WWE system. Sure, he still had a purpose in putting other, younger talent over, but considering that he wasn't that old himself, that has to be seen as a step down overall. Come on now, just think about a top-level wrestler today around the 40 years old mark and imagine them being used this way. We're talking about names like Cody Rhodes and Roman Reigns here. Hell, by that logic, someone like CM Punk would be well and truly over the hill. Obviously, this isn't the case though, but back then it was, and that meant Ray Traylor's final years saw him do little of relevance at all. And we say final years because it would be in 2004 that he'd sadly pass away at just 41. At least when we talk about our next subject then, they're still alive and well today, though they're also a case of someone who peaked early. Who are we talking about here? Why, X-Pac, of course. Yes, it doesn't matter if it's his early years in WWF as the 1-2-3 Kid, or his subsequent run in WCW as 6, or perhaps his most notable run in Attitude Era WWF as X-Pac. This Minneapolis native was a constant fixture of 90s wrestling. Someone who, while he wasn't always appreciated, was always one of the best performers on any given show. What might seem crazy to think about now, though, is that most of his success happened while he was still incredibly young, in his 20s in fact. That's right, if you look at all three of those eras of Waltman's career we mentioned a moment ago, they all took place before his 30th birthday. Hell, by the time he reached 30, we were entering the Ruthless Aggression era, and that was where things started to go off the rails for the Clique member, because it was here his career definitely waned. Not that he was bad or anything from this point onwards, of course. No, X-Pac remained a fantastic wrestler right up until his in-ring retirement years later. That said, it's undeniable he would never again reach the same levels of popularity once the Attitude Era was over. No, rather than be a key part of both major US companies then, he'd start to move away from the spotlight somewhat when he found himself being released by Vince McMahon and forced to work for the then fledgling TNA instead. Sure, Waltman did have some fun moments in TNA, and his job there did at least allow him to keep a presence on TV for a while longer. But let's move away from someone who peaked in the 90s for a moment and back in time a little to someone who peaked a decade earlier during the 80s, someone who seemed destined to be a long-term superstar until injuries cut this short, the man who goes by the name of Barry Windham. Now, we should clarify here, when we say Barry Windham didn't end up being a long-term superstar, we meant that in terms of him having decades worth of time on top. During the 80s though, and even into the early 90s, he was very much one of the biggest stars in the industry. In his case, however, that would take place in Jim Crockett Promotions and WCW rather than in WWE. As being a Southern boy, this was the type of wrestling he'd grown up loving. Where did it all start for Barry? Well, his first big break with JCP came in 1986 when he joined that roster as an up-and-coming 20-something babyface. With him being so impressive here, he'd soon catch the eye of Ric Flair. And this led to Flair making the rookie look like $1 million in a number of bouts, all while he was ultimately grooming him to join the Four Horsemen in 1988 after Ole Anderson had left the group. And that was where things really took off for the Sweetwater native. Hell, only a few years after becoming a Horseman, he'd be holding up the NWA World's title as his own. Sadly though, this was also where things started taking a turn for the worst, as that was when a knee injury severely hampered what he was capable of doing in the ring. Needless to say then, once that injury happened, the peak years of Barry Windham were over, meaning no more world titles would be in his future. No, despite only being in his 30s by this point, his mid-90s run in WWF as both the Stalker and one half of the New Blackjacks would prove to be a bit of a wash. Instead, it's probably best to remember Windham for the good years he had, the years when he was one of the biggest babyface stars in wrestling. Of course, Barry Windham wasn't the only WCW alumni who peaked early, though. No, the same thing could be said about our next subject too, someone who might not be as famous, but who is certainly notorious in their own way. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Blitzkrieg? Don't remember Blitzkrieg? That's understandable. Like we say, he was never as big of a star as someone like Barry Windham. But that's not to say Jeremiah Ross didn't have success during the early years of his career. Come on now, this is a man who, after only 4 years in the industry, managed to get a job with WCW in 1998, right when that company was on fire business-wise. And the young rookie wouldn't just be given a nothing role here either. No, he'd become a regular fixture in the jewel of that promotion's crown, their cruiserweight division, meaning he regularly got to lock horns with the likes of Rey Mysterio, Dean Malenko, and Juventud Guerrera. As you can probably guess though, given the subject of today's video, this level of success would not be a long-term thing for Blitzkrieg. No, by the time 1999 came around, he would have already flamed out, with him at this point deciding to retire from the ring altogether. And that meant he wouldn't be around to make the jump over to WWF when that promotion bought out WCW in 2001. Could he have been more if he'd hung around for longer? It's hard to say, as there were so many talented cruiserweights back then. But there's every chance he could have at very least got a nice spot on SmackDown during the early days of the Ruthless Aggression era, there doing battles with performers such as Jamie Noble and Tajiri. Hell, he might have even been able to cross paths with our next subject at some point if the timing had been right, a Ruthless Aggression era guy who rose high quickly and then fell low just as quickly again, Maven. Yeah, we all remember Maven, don't we? The winner of the male side of the bracket during the first season of Tough Enough back in 2001. As you can imagine then, getting a fast track to WWE via a game show rubbed a lot of other wrestlers the wrong way, as they had to claw and scratch their way there, often through years of working for hot dogs and handshakes on the indie circuit. But this only motivated the Tennessee native to go that much further in proving he belonged in the spot he did, something he set about doing after debuting on SmackDown later that same year. Sure, he'd never reached the level of a Shawn Michaels or anything, but then no one was expecting this much from a rookie. No, what they were expecting him to do was to take to the craft as quickly as possible. And that was something he did a great job of, so great that come 2002, he'd already be creating notable moments such as eliminating The Undertaker from the Royal Rumble and becoming a hardcore champion for a brief period. Would this be the start of something special for Maven? No, unfortunately, as despite getting to challenge Triple H for the World Heavyweight title on an episode of Raw in early 2003, he'd then almost immediately start sinking back down into a lower mid-card role. And that's exactly where the Tough Enough winner would remain for the rest of his time in WWE. That's right, after all the fanfare of his initial debut had died down, and it was apparent he was still someone who was pretty inexperienced as a wrestler overall, Maven Huffman was positioned in a role more befitting his skill level at the time, a role which it was hoped would allow him to grow at a more natural pace. Except he never ended up growing to be a top-level guy, because it would be in 2005 that he'd be released from his contract. And despite being offered an opportunity to return again in 2008, by that point the Tennessee native was already making too much money in his other ventures, like working at the Home Shopping Network, so he declined this offer. That's right, come the mid-2000s, Maven would have moved on from wrestling, meaning he's absolutely a case of someone who peaked early. Hell, we wouldn't really hear much from him again as wrestling fans all the way up until 2023, when he started his awesome YouTube channel. Thankfully then, this channel has given us all a chance to remember how much fun it was watching him during his peak years, just as it was fun watching everyone we've talked about today peak early.